I remember when they first brought me to Stormvale Castle. My legs still worked then, my arms still ended in hands that could hold a sword properly. The corridors smelled of rust and old blood, and somewhere deep in the stone walls I could hear screaming that never stopped, not even at night when the wind howled through the broken battlements. Lord Godrick stood before us in the courtyard, his grotesque form writhing with dozens of arms that didn't belong to him, fingers twitching independently like dying spiders, and he spoke of glory, of power, of becoming more than what we were born to be. I was young then, foolish enough to believe that serving a demigod meant something, that my life had worth beyond the flesh that contained it. The first graft came 3 weeks later. I had failed to hold the eastern gate when those tarnished came through, their eyes burning with grace I could never possess, and my captain dragged me before Godrick himself. The Lord's many hands reached for me, some pale and delicate like a maiden's, others thick and calloused from years of war, and he said I was weak, incomplete, that he would make me whole. They took me to the lower chambers where the grafted scions crawled across the ceiling like overgrown infants, their bodies a nightmare of limbs stitched together without reason or mercy. The surgeon wore no face beneath his hood, just darkness that seemed to drink in the torchlight, and his tools were still wet with someone else's blood when he began cutting into my shoulder. I screamed until my throat went raw, feeling the foreign arm being sewn into my flesh, nerves firing randomly as they tried to connect to pathways that were never meant to exist. The arm was stronger than mine had been, taken from some warrior who died clutching his great axe, and when it finally moved at my command, I felt his memories bleeding in brief flashes of a family I'd never met, a home I'd never seen. Days blurred into weeks as more pieces. A leg from a knight who could run faster than horses, eyes from an archer who could see through fog, fingers that remembered spells I'd never learned. Each addition brought new pain, new voices whispering in my skull, new impulses that weren't my own. My bunkmate hung himself after his third graft, using the extra arms they'd given him to tie the noose, while his original hands clawed at his throat, trying to save himself from himself. I found him in the morning, his faces, they'd given him 3, all wearing different expressions, one peaceful, one terrified, one still trying to scream. The worst part wasn't the pain or the loss of self. It was the pride Godrick showed in us, calling us his children, his greatest creation, his path to reclaiming the glory of the golden lineage. He would parade us before visiting nobles, showing how our bodies could bend in impossible ways, how we could wield 6 swords at once, how we'd transcended the limitations of our birth. I started forgetting my mother's face after the 7th graft. Her voice faded after the 10th. By the 15th, I couldn't remember if I'd ever had a mother at all, or if that was a memory from one of the arms, one of the legs, one of the tongues that now filled my mouth, making it hard to speak without multiple voices emerging at once. The grafting chamber became my second home. They would drag in fresh corpses from the battlefield, sometimes not quite corpses yet, and the surgeon would examine them like a craftsman selecting wood, choosing the best pieces for those of us who had survived long enough to be worth the investment. There was a woman, I think she had been beautiful once, before they attached the spider legs to her back and the additional torsos to her sides. She would sing sometimes, all 3 mouths in harmony, lullabies that made the newer soldiers cry themselves to sleep. She killed herself by walking into the grafting flames, her extra limbs dancing as she burned, and I envied her courage. My commander had 57 grafts before his mind finally shattered completely. He would stand in the courtyard arguing with himself, each limb trying to move in different directions, his dozen mouths speaking different languages, some pleading for death, others reciting prayer, still others just screaming. Godrick had him mounted on the walls as a decoration, still alive, still conscious, somewhere in that mass of flesh. The tarnished came more frequently as word spread of Godrick's weakness. We would throw ourselves at them, our grotesque bodies moving with unnatural coordination, extra arms swinging weapons in impossible arcs, additional legs allowing us to scuttle across walls and ceilings like insects. But they had grace, that golden light that marked them as chosen, and we were just meat stitched together in mockery of true strength. I watched my squad mate get cut down by a tarnished with a colossal sword, his grafted parts falling away like autumn leaves, revealing the small, frightened man he had been before Godrick's improvement. In his final moments, his original eyes met mine, and I saw relief there, genuine relief that it was finally over. The grafting never stopped. Even when there were no battles, no fresh materials, the surgeon would move pieces between us, optimizing, improving, never satisfied with his work. My left leg was replaced 3 times, each version supposed to be better than the last, but all I felt was the constant wrongness of flesh that didn't begin with me. Some soldiers tried to escape, but where would we go looking like this? Monsters made of human pieces, walking altars to Godrick's delusions of grandeur. The world beyond Stormvale held no place for us. We were trapped between the horror of what we become and the fear of dying incomplete, unfinished, our suffering meaningless. The children were the worst. Godrick would have them brought in from the villages, promising their parents glory and purpose, and then the surgeon would begin his work. Their screams were different from adult screams, higher, more primal, and they would call for mothers who had sold them for a handful of runes and the promise of protection. I tried to help one child, a boy no more than 12 summers, who still had his original face above a body made of warrior parts. I tried to teach him how to move with his new limb, how to quiet the voices of the dead that came with each graft, but one morning I found his bed empty, and later saw his head attached to one of the grafted scions, his eyes still blinking, still aware. The feast nights were when Godrick would display us to visiting lords, though fewer came, as his reputation spread. We would stand in formation, modified bodies dressed in armor that never fit right, performing combat demonstrations while the guests tried to hide their disgust behind politeness. One visiting noble vomited when he saw what moved beneath my helmet, the extra eyes blinking in sequence, the additional mouths trying to smile. My memories became a scrambled mess of lives not lived by me. I remembered dying in battles I'd never fought, kissing lovers I'd never met, holding children that were never born to me. Sometimes I would wake, not knowing which thoughts were mine, which body parts were original, whether I had always been this way, or if there had been a before. The surgeon eventually grafted himself, unable to resist the promise of improvement. He attached arms from other surgeons to himself, hoping to increase his skill, but the hands fought each other during operations, each trying to cut in different ways, and he ruined 3 soldiers before Godrick had him fed to the grafted scions. Winter in Stormvale was agony for us grafted soldiers. The cold affected each part differently, some limbs going numb, while others burned with phantom frostbite from deaths long past. We would huddle together for warmth, our monstrous forms pressed against each other, and in those moments we almost felt human again, united in our suffering. I learned to fear sleep more than battle. In dreams, the original owners of my parts would visit me, angry at the desecration of their bodies, demanding to know why I wore their flesh like stolen clothes. A knight whose arms I bore would strangle me in my sleep with my own hand, until I woke gasping, my throat bearing the bruises of my own fingers. The religious among us prayed to the Erd tree for salvation, but what God would accept prayers from mouths that weren't originally ours, from hands folded in supplication that had belonged to heathens and believers alike, all mixed together without regard for faith or blasphemy. There was a mirror in the lower barracks, and most soldiers avoided it, but I would stand before it sometimes, trying to remember what I had looked like before. The thing that stared back was neither human nor monster, but something between, a testament to the failure of ambition, to the price of trying to transcend the limits set by the greater will. When my original heart finally gave out, worn from pumping blood to too many limbs, The surgeon replaced it with 3 hearts from 3 different men. Now I felt 3 different rhythms in my chest, 3 different rates of panic when the tarnished breached our walls, 3 different ways of loving and hating what I had become. The grafted soldiers who survived longest developed a kind of madness that looked like sanity. We would speak normally, move with purpose, follow orders, but inside we were hollow, our sense of self so fractured that we simply stopped trying to hold it together. We became the grafts, let the foreign parts guide us, surrendered to being a collection rather than a person. Spring brought new raids and fresh materials for grafting. I watched them bring in a whole battalion of defeated soldiers, still alive but barely, and knew that their parts would soon be distributed among us, their strength added to our own, their memories mixing with the chorus already screaming in our heads. A young soldier, freshly grafted with only 2 additional arms, asked me how to make the voices stop. I told him the truth, that they never stop. You just learn to stop listening to yourself among them, to become nothing so that everything else can be something. He killed himself that night, and I was jealous of his courage to choose while he still knew who was making the choice. The grafted scions were what we all feared becoming, the final stage of Godrick's vision, where humanity was completely lost beneath the writhing mass of flesh and limbs. They didn't speak anymore, just wheezed and gurgled, their original selves buried so deep under the grafts that even death might not free them. My captain, or what remained of him after 43 grafts, would sometimes remember his wife's name in the middle of battle, screaming it while his multiple arms swung weapons in perfect lethal coordination. The cognitive dissonance of love and violence, memory and madness, all contained in one impossible body, was perhaps the truest representation of what Godrick had made us. The Feast of Grafting came twice a year, when Godrick would oversee mass augmentations, trying to create his perfect soldiers. The screaming would echo through Stormvale for days, and the survivor count was never more than half. But those who lived through it emerged as something beyond mere grafted soldiers, becoming weapons that barely remembered being human. I stopped counting my grafts after 20. The number became meaningless when I couldn't tell where I ended and others began, when my thoughts were committees of the dead voting on actions, when my body moved with the muscle memory of a dozen different warriors, all trying to fight their own battles through me. There were stories of grafted soldiers who found ways to burn out the foreign parts, to reclaim their original bodies through fire or blade, but these were fairy tales told by the newly grafted who still had hope. The truth was that once the surgeon's work was done, separation meant death, our original bodies too dependent on the stolen strength to survive alone. The children's grafts were the ones that haunted me most. Sometimes I would feel a child's hand among my collection of limbs, still trying to reach for a parent's comfort, still soft despite being attached to my scarred frame. Those hands would tremble during battles, remembering bedtime stories instead of sword techniques, and I would have to force them to grip weapons they were never meant to hold. My fellow soldiers and I developed a wordless understanding, communicating through glances from our original eyes, the only parts we could trust to be truly ours. We would look at each other across the battlefield or the mess hall, and in those looks were whole conversations about loss, about what we'd become, about the mercy we hoped the tarnished would show us. The worst grafts were those that came with strong personalities still attached, a berserker's arm that would fly into rages without warning, a scholar's head that constantly whispered magical theorems while I tried to sleep, a lover's heart that ached for someone I'd never met. These parts fought against integration, maintaining their own identities, even as they were sewn into mine. Godrick would sometimes walk among us, his many hands touching our grafts like a gardener, checking his flowers, commenting on the quality of the stitching, the integration of the nerves, the successful marriage of disparate flesh. His pride in us was more horrible than hatred would have been, this genuine belief that he had improved us, elevated us, made us worthy. The rain in Stormvale carried a particular horror for the grafted, as water would seep into the seams where flesh met foreign flesh, creating an itch that could never be scratched because the nerves didn't properly connect. We would stand in the rain, twitching and writhing, our bodies trying to reject what had been forced upon them, but unable to complete the action. I began to lose time, whole days disappearing as different parts of me took control. I would come to awareness standing in parts of the castle I didn't remember walking to, holding objects I didn't remember picking up, sometimes covered in blood that might have been mine or might have been someone else's. I could never be sure. The servants in the castle feared us more than they feared Godrick. At least with him they knew what monster they served, but we were unpredictable, human enough to remember kindness, but too broken to properly express it, reaching out with too many hands, speaking with too many voices, trying to connect to a humanity we'd lost in pieces. My dreams became archaeological digs through layers of memory that weren't mine. A farmer's knowledge of seasons overlaying a knight's battle tactics, overlaying a child's fear of the dark, all pressed together in a mind that had to accommodate them all or shatter completely. Sometimes, shattering seemed like the kinder option. The Tarnished, who finally killed me, looked into my eyes, my original eyes, and I saw him recognize something human still trapped in there. His blade was merciful, quick, severing the major connections before attacking the grafted parts. As I fell apart, literally fell apart with pieces dropping away like a demolished building, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my first day in Stormvale. I felt singular. In those final moments, as my grafted parts twitched their last and my original body finally failed, I remembered my name. Not the names of all the others who had been attached to me, not the titles Godrick had given me, but my actual name, the one my mother had chosen before I was sold to a lord's ambition. I tried to speak it, to say my own name one last time, but my mouth was no longer just mine, and what emerged was a chorus of final words from all the dead I'd been carrying. The Tarnished stood over me, waiting until the last graft stopped moving, and I wanted to thank him but couldn't remember which voice was mine anymore. The other grafted soldiers watched from the walls as I died, their multiple eyes reflecting understanding, envy, and the terrible knowledge that their own ends would be similar, dissolved into part, their original selves so diluted that death would be just another grafting, adding their pieces to the castle's endless collection of flesh. My last thought, if it was truly mine and not borrowed from one of the grafts, was that Godrick had succeeded in making us more than human, but in doing so had made us less than nothing, fragments of fragments, echoes of people who had already died, walking monuments to the failure of forced transcendence. The golden grace of the Erd Tree never touched us grafted soldiers. We were too corrupted, too mixed, too far from whatever plan the greater will had intended. We existed in the spaces between life and death, between self and other, between human and monster, and in those spaces we learned that there are fates worse than hollowing, worse than curses, worse than simple death. Sometimes, in the walls of Stormvale, you can still hear us screaming, not from our mouths, but from the very stones where our blood soaked in, where our extra parts were discarded, where our minds finally broke. The castle remembers us, its grafted soldiers, even if history will not, and in that remembering is a warning about the price of trying to become more by taking from others. The new soldiers arrive at Stormvale still drawn by promises of power, of purpose, of becoming greater than their birth allowed. They walk the same corridors I walked, smell the same rust and blood, hear the same endless screaming, and some of them, the unlucky ones, will survive long enough to understand what they've truly volunteered for. And somewhere, in the lower chambers, the new surgeon prepares his tools, selects his materials, and continues Godrick's great work, creating soldiers who are many and yet none, strong beyond measure and yet broken beyond repair, perfect weapons who can never remember what they're fighting for or who they used to be before the cutting began. The grafting never ends in Stormvale. It just waits for new volunteers, new materials, new combinations of flesh and madness to try, always reaching for a perfection that exists only in a broken demigod's dreams, built on the screaming foundation of soldiers who learned too late that being more than human means being less than yourself. In the end, we were not soldiers or monsters or failed experiments. We were warnings written in flesh and sutured with gold thread, telling all who would listen that the path to power through theft of others' strength leads only to a fragmenting of self so complete that even death cannot make you whole again. The grafting chambers beneath Stormvale stretched deeper than most knew, carved into rock that wept with moisture and something else, something that might have been the earth itself rejecting what happened within. I discovered these depths during my 23rd modification, when they needed to replace my spine with something that could support the 6 additional arms they were planning to attach. The surgeon's new apprentice was a girl who had volunteered for grafting but showed aptitude for the knife instead. Her hands were steady even when she was cutting into someone who was screaming, begging, offering anything to make it stop. She would hum while she worked, old songs from before the shattering, and somehow that made it worse, this normalcy overlaying atrocity. I remember the day they brought in a commander from Lendel, still wearing his golden armor, still alive despite the spear wound through his chest. They kept him breathing just long enough to harvest, and I received his legs, powerful things that remembered marching in formation, standing at attention, kneeling before Queen Marika herself in days when the Erd Tree's light meant blessing instead of abandonment. These legs would try to march me to places I didn't want to go, following patrol routes from a capital I'd never seen, stopping at guard posts that didn't exist in Stormvale. Sometimes I would find myself standing at attention in empty hallways, my body locked in a salute to commanders long dead, unable to move until the memory passed. The integration process was different for each graft. Some parts accepted their new home readily, grateful perhaps to continue existing in any form. Others fought every moment, sending shoots of pain through nerve connections, rejecting the foreign blood, trying to die rather than live as part of something else. These rebellious parts had to be subdued with tinctures that made everything taste like copper and rot. There was a room where they kept the failures, the grafted soldiers whose modifications had gone wrong, but not wrong enough to kill them. They were studied, documented, their agonies catalogued for future reference. I was stationed there once as guard, watching over things that had been human, that might still be human, somewhere under the mass of incorrectly fused flesh. One failure had been given too many hearts, 7 in total, and they beat at different rhythms, causing his blood to move in stutters and surges. He would faint and wake constantly, his body unable to maintain consistent circulation, aging rapidly in some parts while others remained young, a timeline of flesh that made no sense. Another had received grafts that included heads, fully conscious heads that would argue with each other, each trying to control the shared body. They had to be fed separately, each mouth demanding different foods, and when they slept, which was rare, you could hear them whimpering in harmony. The only thing they could agree on was their shared misery. The worst failure I saw was a soldier whose grafts had begun growing on their own, spreading like cancer, developing tiny vestigial limbs and organs that served no purpose except to consume resources and cause pain. He begged us to kill him every day, but Godrick wanted him studied, wanted to understand this mutation, this evolution of his art. My bunkmate, after my 30th graft, was a woman whose entire lower body had been replaced with parts from different soldiers. She moved like a spider, her legs not quite coordinating, each remembering different ways to walk. At night, she would cry about not being able to remember how her original body had felt, how she had moved when she was whole. The grafted soldiers developed their own culture, their own understanding born from shared horror. We had signals, ways of warning each other when the surgeon was looking for volunteers, when Godrick was in one of his experimental moods, when the tarnished were approaching, and battle would soon provide sweet release. There was a black market in the castle for numbing agents, anything that could dull the constant awareness of being multiple people in one body. Some soldiers learned to brew tinctures from the roses that grew in the courtyard, roses fed by our blood, that could make you forget for a few hours which parts were yours and which were grafted. I traded a memory, an actual memory extracted by the castle's confessor, for a vial of forgetting. The memory was of my first kiss, and I reasoned it wasn't truly mine anymore anyway, possibly belonging to one of the many faces I now wore beneath my helm. The forgetting worked, but when it wore off, the awareness came back doubled, trebled, like paying interest on borrowed peace. The children disturbed us, grafted soldiers, most because they adapted too well. Their bodies, still growing, actually accepted the grabs more easily, integrating them in ways adult bodies couldn't. They became perfect weapons, but in doing so lost any memory of having been children at all. They would play war games with real weapons, laughing as they cut each other apart, knowing they would just be grafted back together. There was a chapel in Stormvale, abandoned except for us, where grafted soldiers would go to pray. We didn't pray to the Erd Tree or the Greater Will. We prayed to nothing, to the void, to the hope that consciousness could end, that somewhere past death there was a place where we could be singular again, where we could exist without the chorus of the dead singing in our skulls. My 41st graft came with a musician's hand, delicate things that remembered complex instruments. These hands would move on their own, playing invisible harps, pressing keys that weren't there, conducting orchestras only they could hear. During battles, while my other hands fought, these would be performing their phantom concerts, a macabre dance of violence and art. The feasting hall where we ate was segregated, grafted soldiers at our own tables, unable to remove our helmets, because what lay beneath would ruin anyone's appetite. We learned to eat like animals, quickly, efficiently, not tasting, just consuming, fuel for bodies that burned through resources trying to keep too many parts alive. Some grafted soldiers fell in love with each other, or what passed for love when you couldn't be sure which emotions were yours. They would hold each other with all their arms, speak endearments with all their mouths, and in those moments you could almost see beauty in the horror, connection transcending the butchery that had made us. I witnessed a wedding once, two grafted soldiers who had decided that if they couldn't be whole alone, perhaps they could be whole together. The ceremony was attended only by others like us, and when they kissed, it was with faces that weren't originally theirs, but the tenderness was real, even if nothing else was. Winter brought a plague to Stormvale, something that affected grafted flesh differently than normal tissue. My original parts developed fever, while the grafted ones turned cold, creating a temperature war within my body that left me delirious for weeks. I dreamed of being dissected, sorted back into original pieces, each part returning to its grave. The plague claimed half the grafted soldiers, but not through death, through rejection. Bodies that had accepted grafts for years suddenly began refusing them, flesh necrotizing at the seams, parts falling off like overripe fruit. The surgeon worked day and night trying to reattach, to maintain his creations, but the plague was stronger than his stitching. Those who survived the plague were changed, our bodies having reached some new equilibrium with the graft. We moved more smoothly, thought more clearly, but at the cost of forgetting even more of who we had been. It was as if the plague had burned away the last resistance to becoming truly grafted, truly multiple, truly lost. Spring brought new, tarnished, always new tarnished, with their grace and their purpose and their whole original bodies. We threw ourselves at them with renewed fury, jealous of their singularity, their clean memories, their deaths that would mean something. Every grafted soldier who fell to a tarnished blade was celebrated quietly by those who remained. Another one free, another one released. I began keeping a journal, though I couldn't be sure whose handwriting I was using, which memories I was recording. The pages filled with contradictions, battles I couldn't have fought, people I couldn't have known, places I'd never been but remembered perfectly. It was less a record of my life than an archaeology of all the lives I'd absorbed. The journal became popular among the grafted soldiers, passed around like a holy book, each adding their own confused memories, creating a collective record of our dissolution. Someone titled it The Chronicle of the Manifold Dead, and it became our history, the only proof that we had existed as individuals before becoming composites. My 50th graft was a milestone that few reached. The surgeon presented me to Godrick as a masterwork, a perfect soldier, more weapon than man. I had arms from 20 different warriors, legs from a dozen runners, eyes from scouts and archers, hearts from berserkers and knights, all somehow maintaining their function, all somehow keeping me alive and moving. Godrick rewarded me with consciousness retention therapy, a process where they tried to strengthen my original personality against the crowd of grafted ones. It involved needles in the brain, electricity through the nerves, chemicals that made me see colors that didn't exist. It didn't work, but it did make me aware of every single voice in my head as distinct entities, a clarity that was worse than confusion. The summer solstice was celebrated in Stormvale with a grand tournament where grafted soldiers fought each other for the entertainment of visiting dignitaries. We were paired based on our modifications, multi-armed against multi-legged, those with extra heads against those with extra torsos. The violence was real, the deaths permanent, and the winners received the honor of choosing their next graft. I won my bout against a soldier who had been grafted with parts from beasts as well as men. His wolf arms were strong but predictable, and my musician's hands knew rhythms he couldn't match. As he died, all his parts shutting down in sequence like instruments leaving an orchestra, he thanked me with his original voice, the only one that mattered in the end. My choice for the next graft was refused. I had asked for nothing, for no more additions, but that wasn't how Godrick's army worked. Instead, they gave me the tongue of a prophet, someone who had spoken truths before the shattering. This tongue would sometimes take over, spouting prophecies about the fate of the lands between, about the return of destined death, about things I didn't understand but felt compelled to speak. The prophet's tongue brought followers among the newer grafted soldiers, those still looking for meaning in their transformation. They would gather around me when the prophecies came, listening to words that weren't mine, about futures none of us would see. I became an unwilling oracle, my mouth borrowed by the dead to speak truths nobody wanted to hear. One prophecy spoke of Godrick's fall, of a tarnished who would come bearing the power of other demigods, who would destroy the grafted horror of Stormvale. The prophecy came during a feast in front of Godrick himself, and I couldn't stop the words, couldn't control the tongue that had been sewn into my mouth. He laughed, calling it the rambling of confused flesh, but I saw fear in his many eyes. After the prophecy, I was marked for special observation. Guards followed me. Scribes recorded everything I said, whether it came from me or the prophet's tongue or any of the dozen other voices that might emerge. I became a living library of the dead's last words, final thoughts, unfinished business that tried to complete itself through my composite form. The observation revealed patterns in our madness. Grafted soldiers went through stages like metamorphosis, but instead of butterfly from caterpillar, we became something without a name, something language hadn't been invented for. First came the resistance, then acceptance, then integration, then dissolution, and finally, for those who lasted long enough, transcendent horror, where we became so far from human that we circled back to something almost divine in its wrongness. I reached that final stage on my 60th graft. I could no longer count my parts, no longer distinguish between original and added, no longer cared to try. I moved through Stormvale like a force of nature, my body responding to threats before my mind recognized them, my many hands performing tasks independently while my consciousness floated somewhere above, watching but not controlling. In this state, I could see the other grafted soldiers as they truly were, not monsters but monuments to ambition's failure, walking graveyards where the dead were forced to dance together, puppeted by the delusion of a demigod who thought power could be stolen and worn like armor. We were Godrick's attempt to cheat the natural order, to become strong without earning strength, to be many without losing the self. But the self was lost anyway, dissolved in the sea of others, drowned in foreign blood, and memories and muscles that moved without permission. We were living proof that there are prices too high to pay for power, that some transformation cannot be survived even when the body continues moving. The newer recruits still arrived with hope in their eyes, believing they would be different, that they would maintain themselves through the grafting process. We older soldiers didn't warn them what would be the point. They would learn as we had learned, one piece at a time, one scream at a time, one forgotten memory at a time. My dreams became conferences of the dead, all my grafted parts' original owners, gathering to discuss what should be done with the body they now shared. The farmer wanted to return to fields that no longer existed. The knight sought battles already lost. The child cried for parents long buried. The prophet spoke of futures that would never come to pass, and I, whatever I was, listened to them all, unable to grant any of their wishes. Sometimes I would wake to find myself having completed tasks I didn't remember starting, letters written in handwriting I didn't recognize to people I'd never met, weapons cleaned and sharpened by hands that knew their maintenance better than I did, prayers spoken to gods I didn't believe in. My body had become a democracy of the dead, each part voting on actions, the majority ruling, while my consciousness became just another voice in the chorus. The torture chambers of Stormvale were managed by grafted soldiers who had been modified specifically for the task, given hands that knew pressure points, eyes that could see when someone was lying, ears that could distinguish between screams of truth and deception. They were artists of agony, but even they were horrified by what they'd become, masters of suffering who couldn't escape their own. I was assigned to torture duty once, my prophet's tongue useful, for determining when prisoners spoke truth. The experience broke something in me that was already cracked, watching my hands, not my hands, extract confessions through techniques I'd never learned but somehow knew. The prisoners begged for death, and I envied them the simplicity of their suffering, their singular pain in their original bodies. The castle's lower reaches held experiments that even Godrick didn't fully understand, grafting projects that had evolved beyond his original vision. Soldiers fused not just with other humans, but with the castle itself, becoming living walls that screamed, floors that bled, ceilings that watched with too many eyes. They were still conscious, still aware, built into the architecture like suffering foundations. One soldier had been grafted into the throne room's doors, his arms becoming the handles, his legs the hinges, his torso stretched across the wood like leather. He had to open and close for visitors, his body bending in ways that broke him anew each time. But he couldn't die. The grafts wouldn't let him, keeping him functional, keeping him screaming silently with a mouth that had been sewn shut to prevent disturbing the guests. The gardens of Stormvale were fertilized with the parts that didn't take, the rejected grafts, the pieces that necrotized and fell off. Nothing grew right in that soil. The plants twisted wrong, bearing fruit that looked like small hands, flowers with petals like eyelids that would blink in the wind. We were ordered to eat from these gardens, completing some circle of horror that Godrick found poetic. My 72nd graft came with memories of literacy I hadn't possessed, the ability to read in languages I'd never learned. Suddenly the castle's library was open to me, texts about the grafting process, about the history of flesh modification, about the theological implications of mixing souls through body parts. The knowledge didn't bring comfort, only deeper understanding of how thoroughly we'd been destroyed. The texts revealed that grafting was an ancient art, predating Godrick, possibly predating the Erd Tree itself. There were illustrations of early experiments, crude compared to our surgeon's work, but recognizable in their intent, the desire to exceed human limitations by theft rather than growth, by addition rather than evolution. We were part of a tradition of failure stretching back ages. Some texts suggested that grafted soldiers could achieve a form of immortality, not through extended life but through distribution, parts of us continuing in different bodies, memories and skills passed on through flesh, like inherited wisdom. It was immortality as dissolution, existence as scattered fragments, consciousness as an infection spreading through multiple hosts. I found my name in one of the ledgers, my original name before the grafting, and it meant nothing to me, seemed to belong to someone else, someone who had died the moment the first foreign flesh was sewn to his body. Next to the name was a list of my modifications, clinical and precise, reducing my transformation to inventory, my horror to bureaucracy. The list showed that I had received parts from 83 different people, that my original body was now less than 10% of my total mass, that I was more crowd than individual, more cemetery than soldier. The surgeon had noted that I was one of his successes: stable integration, minimal rejection, optimal combat efficiency. Success was a strange word for what I'd become. The other grafted soldiers had their own entries, their own lists, their own reductions to parts and percentages. We would sometimes compare, like children comparing scars, finding odd pride in our modifications even as we hated them. The soldier with the most grafts was at 97, though he could no longer speak, just wheezed through 8 different throats, a breathing orchestra of suffering. Battle became our only peace, the one time when all our parts worked in harmony toward a single goal. The muscle memory of warriors guided our movements, the instincts of soldiers overrode our confusion, and for those moments of violence, we were unified, purposeful, almost whole. We sought battle like addicts sought their fix, craving the simplicity of kill or be killed over the complexity of our existence. I killed a tarnished once, got lucky with a strike from an arm that had belonged to a legendary swordsman. As he died, grace left his eyes, and for a moment, just a moment, I thought I saw envy there. Envy that I would continue in my horrible state while he escaped to whatever came after. His death felt like a betrayal, leaving me behind in this flesh prison while he moved on to something cleaner. The seasons in Stormvale became meaningless except for how they affected our graft. Summer meant infection at the seams, winter meant different parts freezing at different rates, spring brought allergies that only some portions of our bodies experienced, autumn made the older grafts ache with memories of harvests they'd never see again. We existed outside natural cycles, neither living nor dead, neither healing nor dying. My 100th graft was celebrated by the surgeon as a masterpiece of his craft. A full century of modifications, he announced, more than any soldier had survived before. He presented me to Godrick like a prize, and the Lord examined me with all his hand, praising the integration, the functionality, the perfect horror of what I'd become. He called me the future of his army, and I wanted to die more than I'd ever wanted anything. But death was no longer mine to choose. Too many parts had their own survival instincts. Too many grafted pieces fought to continue existing. Suicide attempts were thwarted by hands that wouldn't obey, legs that walked away from dangers the rest of me sought, hearts that kept beating despite my will for them to stop. I was democratically outvoted by my own body, condemned to continue by committee. The new soldiers looked at us century grafted with awe and terror, seeing their own futures in our twisted forms. Some would try to speak to us, seeking wisdom or warning, but what could we tell them that the evidence of our bodies didn't already scream? We were cautionary tales made flesh, walking arguments against ambition, breathing proof that some prices were too high for any power. The grafting chamber evolved over time, new techniques developed through our suffering. They learned to preserve memories in transplanted parts, to maintain skill sets through nerve preservation, to create soldiers who were not just physically enhanced, but mentally multiplied, containing entire battalions worth of experience in single bodies. We were becoming libraries of war, encyclopedias of violence bound in flesh. My 110th graft brought something unexpected, the eyes of someone who had witnessed the shattering itself, who had seen the demigod's war, who had watched the Elden Ring break. These memories were different from personal ones. They were historical, epical, and they put our suffering in cosmic context. We were footnotes in a larger tragedy, our horror just a small symptom of a world gone fundamentally wrong. Through these eyes I saw visions of what the lands between had been before, when the Erd tree's light was purely golden, when death was temporary and grafting unnecessary, because bodies were whole and strong and blessed by grace. The contrast with our current state was unbearable, knowing that we were living in the ruins of something better, twisted reflections of what humanity could have been. The visions came unbidden, overlaying reality with memory, and I would sometimes find myself standing in Stormvale while seeing it as it had been, whole and proud and clean of blood. The temporal displacement was maddening, existing in multiple times as well as multiple bodies, stretched across history as well as flesh. Other soldiers with similar grafts reported comparable experiences, memories that transcended the personal and touched the mythic. We were becoming unwilling historians, our bodies archives of the lands between's decline, carrying the weight of collective memory alongside our individual dissolution. The surgeon called it an unexpected benefit, but we knew it for what it was, another layer of torment, another way to be broken. The prophet's tongue in my mouth began speaking more frequently, urgently, warning of a coming tarnished, who would bear the power of the Elden Ring itself, who would make Godrick's grafting seem like child's play in comparison to the transformation they would undergo. The prophecies frightened even us grafted soldiers, suggesting changes that would make our modifications look natural by comparison. My fellow soldiers started treating me as an oracle, which was wrong because I was just the messenger, or rather, my mouth was just the medium through which a dead prophet spoke. But they needed something to believe in, some structure to make sense of our senseless existence, and prophecy, even borrowed prophecy, gave shape to shapeless suffering. The prophecies spoke of an end, not just to Godrick or Stormvale, but to the entire order that had created us, the system that allowed grafting to be seen as improvement rather than abomination. They spoke of a new age, though whether we grafted soldiers would have any place in it was left unsaid, probably because we wouldn't, couldn't, shouldn't. I began to feel the weight of all my grafts, not just physically, but spiritually, if such a thing was possible for something as fractured as me. Each part carried not just flesh, but the dreams, hopes, fears of its original owner, and I was the reluctant inheritor of all these incomplete lives, these unfinished stories, these deaths that hadn't quite ended. The grafted children grew at unnatural rates, their young bodies adapting to modifications in ways that created new horrors. They would age decades in months in some parts, while remaining childlike in others, creating temporal paradoxes in flesh, beings that were simultaneously infant and elder, innocent and experienced, fresh and ancient. One child, grafted with the arms of warriors and the legs of runners, grew to adult size in weeks, but maintained a child's face, a child's voice, a child's confusion about why everyone looked at him with horror. He would cry for his mother with a voice that didn't match his body, would try to play with toys using hands that could crush stone. The dissonance was unbearable to witness. The surgeon took special interest in the rapid growth children, seeing them as evolution of his craft, proof that grafting could create not just modified humans, but new forms of life entirely. He would document their changes obsessively, measuring, recording, theorizing about applications that made even us grafted soldiers sick to consider. My 130th graft was my last, not because I died or escaped, but because I ceased to be singular enough to graft onto. My body had become so multiple, so divided among sources, that adding new parts simply dissolved into the collective without distinct integration. I had achieved, through absolute modification, a kind of stability in chaos, unchangeable because there was nothing left to change. In this final form, I wandered Stormvale like a monument to Godrick's ambition, a perfect soldier who could no longer remember what he was fighting for, who he was fighting as, or why fighting mattered. My many hands performed their duties automatically, my many eyes watched without seeing, my many hearts beat without feeling, and somewhere in the mass of flesh and memory, something that might once have been me continued to exist, or at least to persist. The Tarnished who finally brought Godrick down looked at us grafted soldiers with something between pity and horror, and in their eyes I saw ourselves reflected truly for the first time. We were not warriors or experiments or evolutions. We were victims of a madness that had dressed itself in the language of improvement, suffering that had been reframed as strength. As Godrick fell, his grafted parts twitching their last, some of us felt our modifications begin to fail, as if his will had been the only thing holding our impossible bodies together. Soldiers who had been stable for years began rejecting graft, flesh necrotizing, memories fragmenting, the artificial unity of our bodies breaking down into constituent parts that remembered they were never meant to be joined. I didn't die when Godrick died, but something ended, some organizing principle that had made my multiplicity bearable. Without his delusion to give structure to our modification, we grafted soldiers began to drift, some staying in Stormvale from habit rather than duty, others wandering into the lands between, spreading our horror across the world like seeds of nightmare. The castle without Godrick became a museum of flesh horror. We grafted soldiers its primary exhibits, maintaining ourselves out of momentum rather than purpose. New Tarnished would pass through and we would fight them or not, depending on which parts of us were in control at any given moment, our actions as fragmented as our bodies. Some soldiers tried to find the surgeon, to force him to reverse what he'd done, but he had disappeared the moment Godrick fell, taking his knowledge with him, leaving us trapped in bodies that were puzzles we couldn't solve, prisons we couldn't escape, monuments we couldn't topple. The prophecies from my borrowed tongue ceased after Godrick's death, as if the future had become too uncertain even for dead prophets to see. Instead, the tongue began reciting names, hundreds of names, all the people whose parts had been grafted onto someone, a rolling obituary that continued day and night, a memorial to the distributed dead. Other grafted soldiers would come to listen to the names, hoping to hear confirmation of whose parts they carried, seeking some identity in the roll call of the grafted. Sometimes they would recognize a name, remember receiving that particular part, and for a moment they would know exactly which memories, which skills, which pains belonged to which former person. The naming became a ritual, a gathering of the grafted to hear the catalogue of their composition, to be reminded that they were made of people who had names, histories, families, lives before becoming components in Godrick's failed army. It was the closest thing to funeral rites we could manage for people who were dead, but still moving, still fighting, still suffering in distributed form. As I recited names through my prophet's tongue, I wondered if my original name would appear, if I would recognize it, if it would mean anything to the thing I'd become. But it never came, lost perhaps in the vast catalogue of the modified, or perhaps I had become so far from my origin that even my name had forgotten me. The lands between moved on after Godrick's fall, new powers rising, new horrors emerging, but we grafted soldiers remained, anachronisms of a particular madness, walking reminders of one demigod's desperate attempt to reclaim strength through theft. We were history made flesh, lessons written in scars and stitches that nobody wanted to read. Some soldiers found peace in madness, letting their minds fragment completely rather than trying to maintain any coherence. They became more like forces of nature than beings, moving through the world in patterns determined by muscle memory and instinct rather than thought or purpose. In a way, they were the lucky ones, freed from the awareness of what they'd become. Others sought meaning in their modification, trying to find purpose in being multiple, in containing multitudes, in being walking graveyards where the dead continued a kind of existence. They formed philosophies of grafting, theologies of the modified, trying to transform their horror into transcendence through interpretation. But most of us simply continued, existed, persisted, without hope or meaning or end, maintained by bodies that wouldn't die, memories that wouldn't fade, grafts that had become more real than whatever we had been originally. We were the undying dead, the singular multiple, the human inhuman, contradictions that breathed and walked and fought and suffered without resolution. The castle's stones remembered us better than history would, stained with our blood, carved with our desperate scratches, echoing with our screams. Stormvale itself had become grafted with our suffering, modified by our presence, transformed from a castle into a monument to the horrors of forced evolution, the price of power stolen rather than earned. In the end, there was no end for us grafted soldiers, only continuation, only persistence, only the eternal present of being many in bodies meant to be one. We were Godrick's true legacy, not his strength or his crown or his pretensions to godhood, but his victims, walking proof that there are worse fates than death, worse transformations than decay, worse eternities than ending. The new age that came after the shattering, whatever form it took, would have to account for us, the grafted, the modified, the multiplied. We were questions about identity that couldn't be answered, problems of personhood that couldn't be solved, wounds in the world that couldn't heal because we were the healing gone wrong, the improvement that destroyed what it meant to improve. And so we continued in Stormvale and beyond, grafted soldiers without a war, modifications without purpose, collections of the dead pretending to be alive, or perhaps living things pretending to be collected dead. The distinction no longer mattered, had never mattered, would never matter to anyone except us. And we were no longer anyone, just everyone, everyone who had been cut apart and sewn together in service to a mad demigod's dream of borrowed power. The grafting never truly ended, even after the surgeon disappeared, even after Godrick fell. It continued in our dreams, in our memories, in the way our parts fought each other for control, in the way we forgot and remembered and forgot again who we had been before the cutting started. We were eternal surgeries, always being modified, always being improved, always becoming more and less than human, in movements too subtle to see but too constant to ignore.